Welcome to Swallow the Gap, the podcast that delves into the critical world of dysphagia practice and education. I'm your host, Dr. Tim Stockdale, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for conversations aiming to bridge gaps in understanding, knowledge, and implementation surrounding dysphagia intervention. We will be a force for change by inspiring critical thinking, facilitating discussion, and promoting professional development. Swallow the Gap is here to discuss, inform, inspire, and connect you with a vibrant community who is dedicated to making positive change. Together, we'll unpack challenges and be open about our own struggles and work to bridge gaps in our field that impact the lives of those living with swallowing difficulties. Our opinions should not be taken to represent our employers or the groups with whom we associate. Nothing we say is legal advice, and nothing should be taken without scrutiny. While we strive for accuracy, we do not imply perfection. We value diversity in backgrounds and opinions, so our guests will not always reflect what we believe. In fact, we may change our minds on topics as we learn because this is how progress is made. Through discussion, critical thinking, and open minds, we serve as catalysts for advancement in medically focused speech-language pathology. Welcome, everybody. Today, I have with me Dr. Ianessa Humbert, who is a world-renowned scientist and swallowologist, the CEO of STEP, the Swallowing Training and Education Portal, and Swallowing Wellness, as well as her partner in crime, the Medical SLP, who is BCS certified in swallowing and swallowing disorders, passionate about advancing education and clinical training in speech pathology, particularly within the medical facets of it and dysphagia, and who is also COO of the Swallowing Training and Education Portal, Rinki Varindani Desai. So thank you, both of you, for coming on here. Known of you both for a long time, and I feel, as with many people who come on to the show with me, kind of dwarfed by all that you've contributed to the field. I mean, Rinki, how long have you been over the Medical SLP Forum as the moderator?
9 years now.
9 years. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Humbert, I mean, I don't even know where to start there. Like, I could go back and I could probably just talk about this whole podcast about how I think you've inspired me and the credentials and the history that you've really brought and the momentum pushing us forward. In fact, so going back, the podcast is predicated on this idea of gaps, right? And so gap being something that is missing between where we are now and our goal, where we want to be. At least that's how I look at it. And so when I was early in my clinical training, anecdotally, I was just going out, I was working at different places, and I was seeing these things that really didn't make sense to me. They were things that we would do that would maybe protect us, or so we would think they would protect us, but they would have a negative impact on the patient in some other way. And so it was shortly after that I went to the Swallowing 101, Normal Swallowing 101 workshop in Gainesville, and just really blown away being immersed in the data from the paper that you and Emily Plowman put out in 2018, looking at some of these gaps from a very empirical perspective. And so that, I cannot overstate how much that's been a catalyst for me in my own growth and how much that's really inspired my desire to go out and try to make a difference. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming on here. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about yourselves before we go on?
Yeah. I just want to add that the way Dr. Humbert and I also met was through their critical thinking in dysphagia management, CTDM, the very first one in 2016, where we were still clinicians who just looked at these researchers with awe, and there was nobody else like Dr. Humbert specifically who was even attempting to bridge that gap between researchers and clinicians. I think a lot of them enjoyed kind of being in those ivory towers and being looked upon as celebrities and thought that messaging in Facebook groups was beneath them, or communicating with clinicians wasn't at the level that they were used to performing at or presenting research at. And I think Dr. Humbert was the first one who kind of threw the ball back in our court and said, we do what we do as researchers. What do you guys want to change as clinicians? What do you think you don't know about the field? You've been practicing for all these years. How can we work together to improve patient care? And believe it or not, that's the first time we met. And 2 years later, we had created the Swallowing Training and Education Portal. So I just want to take this moment as well to thank Dr. Humbert, because I think 20 years down the road, like people are going to look back and say, look at her as somebody who truly changed the trajectory of clinical training and education and inspired so many generations of clinicians to do better for their patients.
Thank you for saying that, Rinki.
Yeah.
Tim, first of all, thank you for inviting Rinki and I to be on your podcast. Very much appreciated. It's so nice to see people who are not traditionally in the science ivory tower pushing things forward. It's exactly what Rinki said. So when I started out in swallowing related work in 2003, doing my dissertation at the NIH and Howard University, I recall very distinctly that when I was there, I remember walking in and the disdain that scientists had for clinicians, specifically speech pathologists. This is not popular, but it is true. And if you don't know what you're up against and you don't know how to fix anything, I specifically recall that there were PhD level speech pathologists there who would say, I would never tell anybody I'm a speech pathologist. Are you kidding me? And it had a lot to do with the way that people are perceived when they go to scientific meetings. It's not so much being a clinician. It's not like that because there are a lot of physicians involved, et cetera. But it was specifically being a speech pathologist. It meant that you were not aware of what you were doing every day. Like you were just sort of walking around checking boxes, et cetera. And I remember going, what? And even things like you go to ASHA. Who goes to ASHA? No serious scientist would ever present at ASHA. And so what I did is I sort of hung on to my ties in the clinical world, but I used my other tentacles to explore the science world. And I think over the time, I just kind of realized that if people all claim that they want to be better at helping patients, like literally you probably will never find anyone from any demographic or walk of life in swallowing professional work that would say that they don't want patients to get better. Not the industry people, not the students, not the professors, not the scientists, not the clinicians yet. So we all have the same goal, but we disagree on how to get there. And that's because of egos. So Rinki is somebody who I became impressed with. We met actually in 2015 at Hopkins. And there are other people who, I'm not going to throw out their names right now, but a lot of clinicians who came to me and said, hey, I really want to get involved. And if I was on a committee or something like that at Dysphagia Research Society or ASHA or wherever, I'd say, well, we can do something together, or I'd be happy to get you on this committee that I'm chairing. And there was always so much pushback. Why are you posting on Facebook? You're a scientist, from other scientists. Why are you answering their questions? I know you do it, but I could never. Why are you even doing clinician courses? That's not going to get you tenure. Why are you studying clinician decision-making? All of these things that led to the paper that I actually think is most brilliant, that Alicia Vos was the first author on for a grant that I wrote. That paper, all of this was strife. The idea that I even study them or even interact with them was like, I didn't even understand what the big deal was. I'm like, I can study the intricacies of a 2 millimeter angle change in vocal fold adduction and get that published in laryngoscope, which I did, right? Yet that will never make anyone's life better other than mine and the people who published it. Literally, it has no clinical relevance. It has statistical significance, but no clinical significance. So I started to realize that, I can publish all these papers and get these grants, and that's fun. For like maybe 20 years down the road, it'll make a difference. But right now, for the patient in front of me, I can only access them by helping clinicians to provide better care. And it took a long time for my style of communication and training to be accepted. It's polarizing. On one hand, it's like, wow, you're giving it to us in layman's terms with analogies and graphics, but also you're so clear and direct about what I don't know, and that hurts my feelings. And so, that often was an issue. But I think as a field, we've gone past that. The arguments I see now online, I started the first podcast in swallowing, and some of the feedback was like, whoa, I'd never heard that before. Or I'd post, you need imaging to see the larynx. And there would just be straight up fights. Now, if you post that, it's crickets. Everyone's like, water is wet. Thanks for sharing. Like, who cares? I'm like, wow, we've really moved forward. So for me, it's been encouraging to know that the tide has changed and that I've played a role in it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I can, even from just the short story, which encompasses a lot, there's so many things that I can pick out. So you talking about how many PhD researchers, speech pathologists or not, have this idea of being in the ivory tower. And what is really a premise of this is to help to bridge the power distance too. because what does the research matter if it's not clinically practical? And so there are two other things that I wanted to follow up with really quickly. Without that is I am very impressed by the big picture mentality in the vision that you've put out there. So you've mentioned ego and the idea of as an individual, you could do X, Y, and Z, and it could really build up your name in the research world, et cetera, versus doing something that's going to help clinicians and patients. And not to say that the research isn't going to, I truly believe it will, but proportionally with where you're going, I mean, that really seems like a primary instigator for what you're doing. It's to make the lives of patients better, to make the lives of clinicians better. And you don't seem to really care that much if it gives people who we shouldn't care about what they think about us a less positive perception of what you're doing because you're doing the right thing in your mind. Is that right?
Yeah, I would describe myself like that even before speech pathology. That's why I tell people speech pathology didn't make me. If I was out there studying toe jam, I was going to be the best toe jam scientist on the planet. Watch. It's who you are before your brain got taken a hold of by society to say this is how you should be. We were talking before, if you don't mind me going back to our just little babble before we hit the record button, and that is you both, Rinki is in a clinical doctoral program and you have completed one. And I want both of you guys to be loud and proud about calling yourself doctor at all times. And the reason is it's not so much, yes, you've put this time into it, but you have experted something, right? You have put the work in to become an expert in something. And if they want to call that doctor, that's great, because there are so many people who I've worked at in very elite locations, whose names I will not mention, who just couldn't find their way out of a box. You know what I'm saying? And they have the official PhD from XYZ, but what are they doing with it? When you get that degree, that is the beginning. Everyone said this to me when I got my PhD from, at the NIH, the big names, blah, blah, blah. It's like, this is the beginning, right? It's almost like saying, I do. You just started. You don't have the same experience as a couple who's been around for 50 years, but you're still married, right? It's the work you do that matters, not just the fact that you got the degree. So if you guys are doing more work that actually pushes our field forward, and you did the work to get that degree, you should be loud and proud about it. Literally, if we don't break down these little political silos, then we are going to be where we are exactly right now, later, just with fancier technology to make ourselves feel better. Ooh, we all have fMRI machines, but we don't know what the brain does. Yay! What is that going to do for anybody if we won't have a conversation? Because we think that there are all these demographics that don't like each other.
And don't you think, Dr. Humbert, that I think one of the things that really makes our partnership so successful, and I'm sure would make other research or clinician partnerships successful, is that ability to drown out the noise. I think we both respect and value the unique strengths and skill sets that we bring to the table. And we have that ability to take everyone's skepticism or questions about our unconventional approach to what they consider traditional ways of training and education as not just obstacles, but we kind of just take on it as something that inspires us to innovate even more. And we have that ability to drown out the noise and put that mission of clinical training and education and improving patient care above all of that, and even above our individual selves.
Right.
And that's what makes our relationship successful.
Yeah. And I think that the difference between what Rinki and I have done versus other ideas that have been ruminated but never came to light that probably could have really made a huge difference and impact in patients' life is we got excited and innovated and created first. Then we later on learned that there was controversy. We didn't create and go, I wonder if so-and-so is going to like this. Let's do a feeler at the Dysphagia Research Society. Let's put it out at ASHA first. Let's tell a few people, hey, this is what I'm thinking about, and see if they like it. We knew what we had. And we created it. And then we found out later. And you know what? If we got good critical feedback, we're like, hey, let's incorporate that. If we got haterism, we're like, looks like we're impacting some people, right? That's cool too.
Which we did get a lot of that. We did right at the get-go.
There were a lot of people who were just straight up disgruntled. I got asked many times before STEP with Dysphagia Grand Rounds, which is our first venture, wasn't it, Rinki? Like we did Dysphagia Grand Rounds for a year, and we were like, we have more to say. And in that process, I was asked, why don't you give it to DRS? Like literally in conversations, why are you out there doing this by yourself? Why don't you give it to us? And then a couple of years later, they did a Dysphagia Grand Round session at the Dysphagia Research Society. I wasn't asked to be a part of it, but it demonstrates one thing, which is when you have an idea, it's probably interesting and innovative because it hasn't been done. And humans instinctively run from uncertainty, even if changing is benevolent, right? If there's any positive aspect in it, the risk of it going bad, which is people not liking you, people saying you're dumb, you failing, a lot of great ideas never get realized because of that. And our field is not known for innovation. Our field is known for, coalescing around the same idea and doing variations on a theme. Like, okay, this is our song. Let's play it with guitar and a symphony. Let's sing it. Let's do a saxophone, but it's the same melody. And then someone sings a different melody and people are like, what are you doing that for? Why are you singing that song? And then eventually we'll go, well, okay, it wasn't that bad. Maybe I'll do it with my triangle. Maybe I'll do it with my xylophone. So they eventually come on board because they like your melody. But at first, you're that one bird on that other tree where they're singing a totally different song. And all the other birds on the other tree is like, hey, birds of a feather flock together. What are you doing over there? And Rinki and I were like, we're just over here harmonizing. We love it.
The idea that you have to have an organization's backing, or that you have to have a corporation or something that's more powerful than yourself, or more powerful than one or two people or three people. It's very, very, I don't even know what the word, it's encouraging to me to see individuals like yourself, just one or two people going out and going against how things are and making a difference. Because you look back historically at how many people you remember by first name, that they're one person and they've made a tremendous difference in whatever capacity that it is. It's not typically just like, oh, right, Great Britain did this and they did a lot, but it wasn't necessarily for the good, because a lot of groupthink and a lot of power and a lot of egos and that sort of thing, versus when they had most of the world under their power, whatever. But then you look at Mohandas Gandhi, one individual, and by him fasting for so long, he used himself as a change agent through whatever mechanism. That was his mechanism. But by fasting for a long period of time, no one wanted to see him die. Everybody loved, well, I'm not going to say everybody, but enough people loved him from both sides that it was meaningful enough to like, okay, we need to get people talking and get something going because we don't want something bad to happen to him. And so that's one example. And you can trace person after person through history. And then now we're going broad, and then we really focal down at what these individuals within speech pathology can do. And so disattaching ourselves from the idea that we hear that a single person can't make a difference. It is easy to gaslight and make that person feel like they can't make a difference, or they're not making a difference. Like, what are you doing? Look at this crowd. Are any of them supporting you? And if any of them were supporting you, if they're not supporting you, then why would you think anyone else would? And I've heard that just when different things in the past with myself, and I haven't been putting myself out there near as much as y'all have. And so I think that is so promising. That shows the power in playing the devil's advocate in your thought process to what is accepted. And to me, that's also the power in diversity, not only in what we look like, but our backgrounds and different things we can bring to the table, because we bring a different perspective. It's not because we echo the same perspective. So we bring something else, whatever that may be, and that changes. It forces people to think critically and not just go with system one, this is how we're doing things, and they're going great, or they're not. Maybe they actually really suck. And we need that. We absolutely need that. So thank you so much. Sorry, you got me very, very excited about this, and because I love it, and I want to go back a bit. You mentioned a paper with Dr. Vose, and I know that she was the lead author, and I know there was another paper in the same year with you and Emily Plowman, and even before that, the Campbell-Taylor letter. But I'm really curious, how do you most see yourself in your contributions as a researcher or a clinician coming together? And what do you think has been the most effective way that you've been able to get conversations started and make change? Or even, can you walk me through a little bit that from your own perspective? Because I see what I see, but I would love to hear what it means to you and your journey with that.
Rinki, you go first.
Yeah. Can we also talk about what trouble you had publishing that paper? Because I'm genuinely curious, and I can share my experience as well, because in the same year, I partnered with another clinician, Yvette McCoy, where we just went out there and we were inspired by or passionate about the fact that clinicians were disgruntled. We knew what we were seeing online, that year after year, clinicians were graduating feeling underprepared, not confident, not competent, being called swallowing experts, but were then expected to provide that expertise, which ultimately impacted people's ability to eat and drink, which obviously has a big quality of life impact. So we're like, let's just survey what's out there. Let's just see how clinicians are feeling. And we were able to get 715 respondents in 3 months, where over nearly 70% of them felt that they did not feel confident in providing dysphagia services. We could not get that paper published anywhere. We were able to get a poster presentation at DRS. We were kind of ridiculed a little bit by some of the researchers who walked past our poster because they felt we didn't have the necessary experience to be presenting at DRS. We couldn't get it published in any ASHA publication. And 2 years later, we were kind of savvy enough to get the results incorporated in a paper about presbyphagia, where we just wanted to get the information out there so that we have a reference to say this is how clinicians are feeling. And I'd love to know what Dr. Humbert's experience was with publishing her paper. And all of this is to say that it's cool to say, yes, there's a problem, we need to do better. But when it really comes down to having that conversation, and even for academics and researchers being vulnerable enough to say we're not doing enough, one course is not enough to train someone about everything about normal swallowing anatomy and physiology and the nuances and complexities of dysphagia management and how can we make this better. Nothing's going to change. So that's kind of where Dr. Humbert and I agreed. We agreed there's a problem. We agreed that graduate programs are not cutting it. You have PhDs often who've not seen a patient for decades, who probably even aren't trained in swallowing, who are now training the next generation of clinicians to provide patient care. And these organizations like ASHA aren't changing anything because at the end of the day, they benefit from clinicians graduating without experience, because then we pay ASHA dues for Learning Pass and for CEU providers for that continuing education, where they're making hundreds and millions of dollars out of clinicians not being prepared. So saying that ASHA is going to fix this for us is not the answer. And that's kind of what inspired Dr. Humbert and I to find a way to make dysphagia training and education affordable, accessible, engaging, evidence-based. We just didn't feel like any clinician should say that they cannot provide patient care because they don't have access to good, high-quality education. And that's kind of been our mission and our journey. And we're 6 years in now. And like I said, I think one of the things that defines us is our resilience. So each time there's pushback, we've obviously had challenges. We've obviously had to constantly pivot and innovate. COVID happened in the middle of all of this. Dr. Humbert puts her coursework out there year after year, but we have to find a way to make people see the value in it and separate it from so much noise that's out there on social media now, and so many people claiming to be experts. So we've kind of, I think, just always kept our mission above all of that and constantly just been fueled by our passion to change clinical training and education and the profession as best as we could.
See, that's one thing I love about Rinki is that a lot of people want change to happen, but they're afraid to say the change that should happen, the problems that we've overcome. And I'm not out here trying to shame, name, and blame at all. But it's kind of pointless to think that we can make any change if everybody is afraid to talk about what the problems are, right? And so I will tell you about some of the issues around getting the paper published, but I also want to say, I agree that the requirement for CEUs does mean that any institution, whether they're CMEs or CEUs, means that there is a way to make money from it. However, the difference I have is that I think STEP should be able to provide much more advanced content. I'm not allowed to make that because I don't think a lot of clinicians would follow. So what would happen is we would still need CEUs, but we would need them for advanced content instead of just, this is the hyoid, this is what it doesn't do, stop obsessing over it. Like year after year after year, I'd be able to really talk about the things that I think about, the things that I'm ruminating. I'd have people at my level to have a conversation with and really be like, hey, can we dialogue about this? I feel lonely is what I'm saying. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I'd love to make this content, but that's 10 years down the road, you know? So I do think CEUs would still be around. I just think that what they would be is far more advanced, in the same way that, you know, if you are a surgeon, you're not like, here's how you scrub up for every year. I think they've gotten past that. Now they're talking about advanced technologies. So that's one thing I wanted to say. But the other thing is, since we're talking about systems in place, we talked about CEUs, but let's talk about publications, right? There's this idea that to get something published in a medical journal that is peer reviewed, preferably double blind review, it is really quite objective, right, and quantitative, and they do everything they can to avoid bias. But the truth is that it is as drama filled and bias ridden as any other thing that we do. There is a veil that that's not the case, but the truth is our area is too small to ever be unaware of what somebody else is doing. If you hear EMST, you're like, Chrysapians? Like, you're not like, unless you've never heard of, you know, EMS. Exactly. You're not, and that's one thing, you've never heard of that technique, then you might not know, but it's only going to be a matter of time before you know which big name is tied to which big thing, right? So in our situation, we actually this paper was published in JSLHR, which is Journal of Speech Language Hearing Research. It was originally submitted to AJSLP, I believe. And the review had some interesting things, like if this comes out, it will impact our reimbursement. Interesting, because bias is not supposed to be objectively stated in scientific review, meaning these data, you know, are compelling, but we can't let it get out there, because what about our money? Those kinds of things are questionable. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And then we had to rework it and soften our language significantly for it to get published in a different journal, because people didn't like it, right? Which tells you you're onto something. We didn't need to do another one because that one told the story that needed to be told. Now, mind you, this is an ASH Foundation funded study. When I submitted to this, it finally got funded by ASH Foundation in 2014. And then we conducted the study for a couple of years, and finally, you know, I moved from, at the time, Hopkins to UF, so there was a bit of a break. We picked it back up, and we were able to do some CTDM to get some data, et cetera. And so we got 2 papers out of that. But this one specifically almost didn't get funded. Again, there was that sort of, I don't know, do we really want her out there to unleash her and fund her, give her wheels and gasoline and a lighter, you know what I mean, to study us? And eventually I just barely skated by in the funding, and I just barely skated by in the publication. Now, again, if I wanted money to measure whether or not the larynx does a 2 millimeter move to the left, I'm going to get money for that quickly, and it's going to get published very quickly, and I'm going to get asked to do talks. Doesn't matter. Does not move the needle, not one bit. But anything that is really impactful often is controversial in a system like we have right now, where people know what the problem is, but cannot say it because they're so afraid of consequences of what everybody thinks. So they clam up and hope to God somebody will say it, but please say it in a way that's palatable, but also somehow impactful. But we already know they don't go together. So to your point about Mahatma Gandhi, sure, he was on a hunger strike, but he was also an attorney in South Africa defending the Indians there to say, it's okay to treat the South Africans like crap, as long as you leave the Indians out of it. We all have a history. So what he's remembered for is the later stuff. MLK said the N-word all the time. I mean, here's the thing about people who do amazing things. They don't really see the boundaries the way that everybody else does, which is why in the moment they're controversial, only for later on for people to be listening to them like, yeah, that was the jazz at the time, because it's also easy to look back when all the tides have changed and now what they're saying has been floated everywhere to pick it up and say it. Just like I said, it was controversial when I went online and said, you need imaging to do that. I mean, people dropped people and followed. It was crazy. You know what I'm saying? And now it's like, anyway. So it's not very interesting to be saying what everybody's been saying, just repeating it again later on, but you might get a platform for it. But the person who said it first and maybe got kicked out for saying it is really your inspiration there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have the luxury of looking back at so many people and so many changes through the lens of history, because history speaks very favorably sometimes of the right thing, right? But when you're surrounded by people who think differently than you, we don't go back and necessarily appreciate what they went through. I mean, we see some of the main things that these change agents have gone through, but I can't imagine with some of the little tiny things, little things that I've tried to get changed, how they've kept me up at night, like waking up in the middle of the night thinking about this and how it bothers me. I can't imagine things of the magnitude of what some of these marvelous people have done and what you all are doing on a much greater scale than anything that I've cracked into. But what I would like to circle back and ask, you had mentioned the idea that if this information gets out here, like people are afraid if this information gets out here, it's going to affect our reimbursement rates. What do you think were some of the most condemning, the most threatening bits of information that came from that?
I think the biggest bit of information was not so much that speech pathologists could not look at a video fluoroscopic image and even identify the primary impairment, and even said that people with normal swallows who are college students had impaired swallows. That's a big hit, because it suggests that you are billing for care for people who are functional. That is basically fraud. But the difference is the assumption is, who's going to check us? Nobody knows what we know. Who's going to go, no, what, radiology, GI, ENT, they're going to look at the problem is there's no one to check us, yet we don't know. So, but we're billing. So we just kind of have to be like, just shut up. Don't tell anybody. You know what I mean? So that's number one. And the other big thing is that then what you want to do is say, right, but they didn't get a dysphagia course. Right, but they didn't take MBSIMP. Right, but they're not BCSS. And what we found is across those categories, it was still abysmal. Do you know what I'm saying? And so the argument is that all of these products that we're selling don't increase the product being a dysphagia course, the product being a training course, the product being at higher level, I don't know, certification or indication of higher skill. I'm not exactly sure how we're categorizing BCSS, right? But the idea there is that those things clearly aren't hitting the mark. If a swallowing expert can't look at an image and go, normal or not, right? Or not identify the wrong problem as the right problem. So that to me is the most compelling thing, because ultimately that's what you're hanging your documentation on, that this person does in fact a problem. That's the first thing. There's an impairment worth fixing. Nobody's getting therapy for being completely normal. So I think that was the beginning of it.
And those are the gaps, right? Just listening to Dr. Humbert, the obvious gap is we're talking about graduate training and education. The next gap is the CFY, where it's called a fellowship, but in the medical world, a fellowship indicates expertise and training, and you're guaranteed a certain level of competence once you finish. You are an expert and a fellow in that subset of medical training or whatever profession you're in. The CFY is just another job where you get on-site supervision at a minimum of 3 times a year, where the person could literally never see you treat a patient and check off a box, and then you're a clinical fellow, which then gives us our C's, certificate of clinical competence, where to the world, to the outside world, and to somebody hiring you, you have that competence. But again, you could have never seen a patient with dysphagia in your entire grad school and CFY training. And again, you're considered to be an expert. So I think that's another big gap. And like Dr. Humbert said, the third big gap is accountability, because oftentimes these new grads just need a job. They just want to get their foot in the door in a SNF or in a hospital, and there's no one checking them. There's no accountability. Everyone working with you assumes you're an expert. You go online in forums and you're told to fake it till you make it. Patients don't know any better because they're looking at you thinking you know what's best for them, and you're never going to have that open, honest conversation telling a patient and their family that I don't know what's best for you. Please go see someone else. So I think unless we encourage these conversations and even agree these are massive gaps that we need to fill, nothing's going to change. And we just have to be open and honest and vulnerable about it.
Absolutely. And so you had mentioned the idea of no accountability, right? But, we have a code of ethics, it's out there, but it's predicated so much on self-reflection. And I'm not saying who is said to fake it till you make it, but that's something that we probably have all heard at one point in time. And so if we are in one place hearing fake it till you make it, that impedes self-reflection. If we're getting offended every time someone points out something that we're not doing right, then that's not going to facilitate good self-reflection. I mean, the idea of if we don't know where we are, how are we going to lead ourselves to the right place in the right direction? And just the accountability, I mean, it's so much self-accountability, but I don't know that even research-wise, there's a very small proportion of people who are considered to be self-aware, just at large. I'm not talking about speech pathologists only, but just at large. It's not a good system. It's not a good mechanism of accountability, because when we get into a position where it's my job, my livelihood, my money, my credibility, all of those things, Or can I look stupid in front of a radiologist or an otolaryngologist or a pulmonologist about what I don't know? I mean, what are most people going to choose just for survival? I think it's human. Like, I've been in that situation. So you know human nature in that particular situation. It's not a system that's really built to promote competency. There is, you guys y'all are making me maybe a little more bold than I should be to go out there and say this. But talking about Dr. Humbert, you mentioned earlier about, and let me caveat this. I got to couch this. I couch stuff too much, but the idea of, I think people with PhDs are typically brilliant. I have so much respect for so many of them. But you had mentioned this idea that it could be someone with a PhD who hasn't seen a client in ages can teach a dysphagia course or a swallowing course. And like, that's fine. They're teaching clinicians who are getting a clinical degree to go out there and see patients, but they don't have the clinical lens. And so when I'm looking at, particularly with the CAA and their numbers and their ratios with a terminal degree and not a terminal degree, like the educational doctorate makes sense and the PhD makes sense too. But the fact that if someone with a clinical doctorate with decent experience, go out and want to teach in a graduate program, that graduate program better be sure to have another PhD, because they're going to pull me up and make the program look better, because certainly I can't teach these students as well as someone with a PhD can, despite clinical experience or no clinical experience. Like, maybe you get someone with their C's and a PhD in psychology or something else that's related, sort of. But what does it mean? There's so much face validity in so many of these things. But when you dig down deeper, there's not real validity to it.
Yeah.
I don't mean that as a blanket, but that's a theme to face validity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, on one hand, I hear what you're saying, right? Sure. Most people teaching a dysphagia class couldn't tell you how a swallow works. I want to line them up all right now in front of me, boot camp the heck out of them. And clinicians are worse. And they're the ones looking at an MBS every day. The paper shows it. Do you know how many clinicians I've talked to in the 400 talks I've had in the last 20 years who raise their hand and assert something? And I'm like, that can't, nope. That whole sentence indicates you have no clue how the UES works. And I go, okay, let's just stop. And can someone just throw their hand up? How does the UES work? Crickets and 50 SLPs who are all obsessed with swallowing every day and been paying their mortgage with it for 7 years. Those are the people who are also tapped to teach dysphagia courses at a lot of accredited universities, because they can't afford a me. And frankly, there's only one. And there's, the other thing is, if there are 100 experts in the United States who have the top knowledge in swallowing, they're still not going to all end up teaching the one dysphagia course because there's 300 accredited programs. So they're going to tap the local SLP at a hospital nursing home and say, can you just fill this requirement? So it's not so much that the PhDs not knowing clinical stuff. And mind you, the theoretical classes aren't for us to go and teach you tubes, lines, and drains, as well as the way the system works. What's the theory behind this? So that when you get your externship with a qualified clinician who also knows this, we are complementing each other with the applied versus not. Do you think the guy who's 70-something years old in some med school who's been teaching organic chem forever, who hasn't seen a patient in forever, who's been in academia, needs to know what it's like when somebody codes on XYZ? And he has an MD, but his job is not to do that, because he knows when those physicians go to that hospital, they're going to get that intense hands-on training. So he doesn't have to do that. So the problem again is that we are expecting everyone to do everything, not just from ARTIC to AC to swallowing, but also somehow the people who are teaching have to have all this theoretical knowledge and all this clinical knowledge. The problem is the system is set up to fail. So when you talk about human nature and this idea that everybody's a race to the bottom, well, we're a race to the bottom with a weighted vest. That's what we've set our system up to be. And when you think about it that way, you have set humans who have a tendency to have egos up for the worst kind of failure, because you put them in a space they're not prepared for. Everyone has an ego, to your point, but they have everything to prove and very little, frankly, to gain, right? Think about this. Swallowing disorders have been around as long as their causes have. So probably millennia. As long as there have been premature births and frailty and strokes and all these things, there have been swallowing disorders. But there's only been a profession whose scope of practice it lives in since the 90s. The 90s. So the healthcare system is overrun with all of these people who are now being identified and no system in place to do anything with them. That's what we're living in. And somehow a speech pathologist, a poor child who just graduated, barely got in training, is supposed to go up against that mountain. And then we're like, how does the hyoid work? And she's like, look, people, I'm just trying to survive in this place. Nobody likes me. Everyone thinks I'm an idiot. And I'm trying. And SLPs before me are competing with me. They're eating their young. So like I said, with this lead vest we have, can we at least identify the lead vest? That's all I've been doing in my career is pointing out the lead vest. Hey, guys, I know you're going to jump out that window, but you got a lead vest on. Is that what you want to do? Or do you want a parachute? And STEP, in my opinion, is an example of a parachute. And there are other things in place that policies people are making that are just, adding more weights on the lead vest. That's all they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you care if I just, sorry, Rinki, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
Let me just throw out there something really quick. So within this, we're talking, I personally, this is how I feel. I like to really say, we're looking at the what, not necessarily the why. We've touched into a lot of the why, but the what that I'm looking at is competency. Clinician competency. And so the last thing that I intend to do is cast the blame on every clinician to say, you're not doing this and you should be. You're not doing this and you should be. I look back at myself right now, yesterday, but especially years ago, at all the things I should have known, all the things I should know now that I still don't yet. And so to me, and you, I believe, have attested to this, it's a system issue. It's not to make every clinician feel bad and feel shameful about what they do or don't know, because that's it, to some extent, to a large degree, really victim to the system they've been brought up in. And I can see that for myself. And I think if we don't realize that, then we're just going to keep on with the status quo, which is not what you all will stand for. And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. However, when does it end?
Mm-hmm.
How long can we blame the system? When you become part of it and now you're pushing that system along, once you realize, ooh, this system did not set me up, but let me get behind it because I don't want to be standing out as a person who is going against it, because you know what happens when you go against it. It's so interesting. I had another consultation for someone who finished the practice portal in the Swallow Physiology Masterclass. And she goes, I'm so afraid of all this knowledge I have, because I know that if I start documenting and putting these timing measures in my documentation, these other SLPs are going to say I'm basically telling them they're doing something wrong. And I said, can we pause for a second? Let me see if I just heard what you said.
Yeah.
You're doing something that you train that can help a patient by being able to identify things in a quantitative way, which is something we all say we need. But you're questioning using these skills because other SLPs might gang up on you and not like you. Is that what you just said? This is the world we live in. This is the problem. There is a lot of sorority and fraternity garbage happening, and it hurts our patients. It's wasteful. It's completely wasteful. You're billing taxpayer dollars to have an attitude and try to one-up your colleague by having this documentation versus another. I can't even imagine the kind of pressure somebody's under when that's the thing they think. I just got this training and I'm afraid to bring it back, even though it helps so many people, because the people who I bring it back to will say that I think I'm better than them. Can you imagine bringing home healthy food to your family, saying, I don't know if we should because our neighbors will think that we're uppity. Let's go for McDonald's. No, we would never do that. So don't you think that the system is perpetuated by individuals who now their egos are tied to this very system that they identified as their oppressor. And now they become the oppressor, like happens all the time, and say, if you can't beat the system, then join it. And so many people have joined the system and they want a savior, but they don't realize when they look in the mirror, that's the only savior there is. At some point, you have to face yourself and say, I'm going to do the self-study. I'm going to stop the chatter when somebody goes, she thinks she's everything, and go, hey guys, maybe we should think of it another way. Maybe you can be the person who's the climate controller and has your hand on the thermostat before it gets too hot or too cold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. One thing, I guess, to place, and I don't even want to say this because I don't want to assume what you're going to say or how you're going to respond to this. But with that individual who came up to you and asked you that question, what do you think they're, after receiving your counsel, what do you think they're going to do now?
I think they're going to figure out a way to do it. And the reason I think they're going to do it is because I think their conscience won't let them do anything else.
And that's fantastic. But maybe for this person and maybe this person only, they realized or were willing to ask the question that may lead them to realize that they need someone else's help who is not as afraid as they are to get scrutiny, who has been through turmoil and that sort of thing. And so that stinks that they had to feel like they needed to ask you that question, but at the same time, they were willing to, and they asked you, they didn't ask someone else who was not as bold, right? That question, and they got the right guidance, and hopefully they'll do the right thing. And so I think if we recognize within ourselves that sometimes we need the extra push and we need the right person to light a fire under our butts and say, no, you need to do this because it's the right thing to do.
Right. That's 100% true. But at the end of the day, it's just like going to the gym. You can sign up for every program online and everyone can talk. You can get the most expensive Nike gear. But if you don't lift that weight yourself, you'll never have it. You'll have everything around it. And so it's those, as I said before in the Fix SLP podcast, it's those micro tears that you get in your muscle from the soreness. That's the process of rebuilding. That's where hypertrophy comes from. And then you go back and you're like, these weights are lighter. No, you're stronger. Mm-hmm. So next time you won't even walk into a room thinking, what are all the things I have to do to exist in this room as an expert in swallowing? You'll just go there and you'll do it. You won't even anticipate how, the weights are going to be so heavy at the gym today. You'll just show up and try your best. But practice what gets you there. And so it's funny you're saying this because we're planning a course on this exact type thing, which is we're actually calling it NICE. And NICE stands for Navigate, Influence, Communicate, Empower. And so, everyone's so obsessed with being nice, but maybe if we turn that on its head and let people practice having difficult conversations, it'll be better. Because to your point about adversity, a lot of people in our field have fit in up until the day they went to their hospital or to their school setting, meaning we have a very homogeneous field. Very few of those individuals likely have walked into grad school and was like, oh, crap. Nobody looks like me. Oh, crap. Like they've pretty much looked a lot like the people they're with. And then suddenly they're with a radiologist who's walking out because somebody aspirated and they're like, we're done here. And they're like, what do I say? Mm-hmm. Some of us have had a lot of experience having to work to get people to listen to us, having to work to know what it's like when people assume you know little about everything. And so by the time the radiologist treats you like that, you're like, sir, here's what we're going to do. Sir, please.
Like you're not the first.
Let me finish. It's just kind of like whatever. And so another weight vest is when you don't have diversity in experience with adversity. When you don't have that, I don't care what color you are. You could have been impoverished as heck in a very white neighborhood. Having lived with poverty is a significant barrier that you have to think about. And those are individuals who understand what it is to have some grit. So beyond just the skin color we have or the religious or whatever background or sexual orientation, there is also adversity and diversity and adversity, and asking people to use that and just asking where they stand on that instead of I was always the one who fit in. Maybe that's a double lead vest in our field because you're not going to fit in as soon as you graduate.
Yeah.
Great point. Rinki, I feel like every time it comes back and you're ready to say something, I'm just like, bah, bah, bah.
That's fine. I don't need to be a checkbox. I think like Ianessa said, I was thinking the diversity thing too, where now DEI is more like a checkbox where you just need someone who looks like me or looks like her, or maybe even you in a female dominated profession to fill a seat.
Ironic is that?
But then are you really being invited to share your voice that's respected and valued? And are we really promoting diversity and equity and inclusion to represent the demographics of the patients we serve? We're not. And this is something it took me a while to realize as well, because when I was getting invited to do stuff or was being added to committees on ASHA and the whole George Floyd thing had happened, Dr. Humbert and I had a conversation and she's like, well, this is just organizations being organizations. They think it's woke and it's now trendy to have a statement out, which is what's happening. And I hadn't experienced that before. And I was all gung-ho and passionate and saying, oh no, the tides are turning, everything's going to change. They respect diversity. Our field is going to be different in 2 years. And I quickly realized that's not the case, because diversity is so much more than that. It's first of all recognizing there's a problem and then realizing what these different voices and perspectives can do for the profession and why you need it. And then, like I said earlier, I come back to embracing vulnerability, leading with authenticity, recognizing that you want to be in these positions of leadership to actually influence change versus just have someone who makes your organization look better, makes your faculty look better.
Do you think it's fair to say that from the perspective that you're referring to, that diversity is good until it challenges you or makes you feel uncomfortable?
Absolutely.
Because it's
Yeah,
going to
well,
bring a
there's,
different
if
perspective.
I can bring Taylor Swift into this.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm telling you,
I mean, she did everything else.
I probably only know two of her songs. Like if I heard them, like I think that's her, right? But today, I was scrolling on Instagram and somebody had a clip of her saying this. I was like, I so feel this moment. She goes, as a woman, we have historically been conditioned to allow men to say what they say, and we silently observe it and we silently deal with it, but we don't necessarily push back. But the interesting thing is that the offensive thing that they said in the first place has been so frequently just observed that when we respond to it, now that is the offense, not the original thing that we're responding to. It's the response itself. And so I believe that I certainly have experienced that when it comes to being not white in this field, where if you say, wait a minute, what did you say? You can't say that to me. Like, oh, how dare she? It's like, wait a minute, you started it by opening your mouth in that way. I'm responding to it. Speech pathology is the same way. We have been so used to just listening to other people in the industry, in the hospitals, the people in charge, doctors and nurses, in the school system, principals and teachers, and they say who we are and they say things about you. Oh, the speech teacher, oh, so-and-so. And the second you respond, it's like, what's up her butt? What's going on there? Calm down. I'm just saying. And you're so used to hearing that about you that when you finally say something, you're the person. So what you said about it's nice to have diversity until you open your mouth and have the nerve to be diverse is true.
We've been on Zoom conversations, Dr. Humbert and I, where the minute we got passionate or excited, we were basically questioned why we were raising our voices or making someone uncomfortable. That was just probably too white and not used to being questioned by somebody like Ianessa and me. Or even my own experience of starting to volunteer with ASHA and trying to make a difference. I've been asked by other SLPs, why were you selected? Like, what makes you special? Or constantly being made to feel like me belonging somewhere was maybe because I was too exotic, which worked in my favor, or maybe my different accent worked in my favor, or the fact that, I didn't belong there because I was different. And I think that's just, now I'm glad I'm at a place, and I'm glad people like Dr. Humbert have inspired me to believe in my own potential and my strengths and recognize that diversity can only add more to what you bring. It doesn't take away from it because you're different.
Yeah. Great points. Question for you both. What are some actionable steps? So we know some things that maybe haven't worked, that have face validity, but haven't done enough. What are some actionable steps within our profession that we can take to embrace intersectionality and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within everywhere, within its ranks and practices across the board?
The first thing that comes to mind is that, and this is not popular because a lot of people want me to say that the makeup of how many Blacks, whites, and Asians and people who identify as queer, blah, 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 that if we just get those numbers up, it'll be better. I'm not saying it won't be better. I'm sure it could be better. But if we get those numbers up and we're still at the bottom in our skill set, I don't know what difference it makes. It's just a different color horse running the opposite direction. If our skill set is in fact better, that tide lifts all boats, period. So I think that being in a field that is so white and so female, at its face, we could argue with that, how did that happen? Well, historical racism and sexism, probably, who knows what the deal is exactly. I don't know. Can't pinpoint how we got here, but we're not going to get out of it by just filling it with a little bit more color or a little bit more this or a little bit more that. We need for our degree to mean something. We need for our skill set in a hospital or school to mean something. The way that it does, if nurses go on strike, everybody's dead. If speech pathologists go on strike, will there be a change, or will the physicians and nurses just give more chin tucks and not see a difference? Will they just take more straws away? Will they do the same thing we do anyway? And if that happens and we have to, we can't even go on strike, because if we do, they're going to be like, yeah, nothing happened. and then we can't come back. The thing about going on strikes, you have to believe that when you leave, you can come back to something. They're going to notice the change, but they might not notice anything because of what we're doing every day. And I don't think that if there were a couple more people who are male or whatever the thing we're missing that would make a difference, I think what would happen is people like me and Rinki and you who don't feel the white female stereotype will get respect just because of our degree. They'd be like, oh, this is a speech pathologist. I don't care what color they look like. They are so well trained. It would make it so that I, Ianessa, don't have to prove myself as a Black person because I'm a speech pathologist and this is what I do. It's sort of like, do you think these celebrities at that level, your Beyoncés and your whoever's, and that's why they're so out there, because they're Beyonce. It doesn't matter anymore. And so if our field can get Beyonce level of staying in our lane, when we're in our lane, we are in our lane. We don't go in your lane, but we know the heck out of our lane. That is what actually matters more so.
The competency.
But it's killing them with competency. Kill them with competency. That's what matters. I mean, you have, and everything they come to you with, boom, boom, boom. And do you have more questions? You have to kill them with that. Not just like, I at least won't kill people. That's to me what competency is now. But when you kill them with that and everything they come to you with, you're like, I'm there or above, that matters.
Yeah. Rinki, you look like...
I just hope that all of us having this conversation can at least inspire other people watching and listening, and future generations of clinicians and researchers not being afraid to challenge norms, not being afraid to break the current systemic barriers that are in place, not being afraid of the strengths that they bring to the table, and recognizing the transformative power in that, whether it's through creating solutions for online training and education like STEP, having this podcast, not being afraid to being different, because that's what's going to influence a positive change in our field, and that's what's going to empower clinicians to do better for their patients. And that's why we're all here. Our patients deserve better outcomes, and they're not getting it because we're too afraid to do anything different. And we're too afraid of what the consequences would be. And I hope this conversation inspires people to drown out that noise and just have it in them to push forward and be those change agents and advocates for their patients.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up, you've talked about some of the resources that you have out there. Would you mind saying a little bit more about the Swallowing Training and Education portal? And I appreciate in the beginning you being so forward about, please mention that I'm the COO of STEP, because I don't want people to perceive that I'm trying to be sneaky with a conflict of interest, because you care about that. And so I have used STEP in in dysphagia courses I've taught, but I found it as a very, very good tool, not the only tool, but an incredible tool to really just break down the basics, because then that lifts the tide, and we're not needing to do continuing education on how does the swallow work, how does the UES work, blah, blah, blah. What does this do? What does that do? Because hopefully students are going out with that. And so I've found it as a tremendously valuable tool. Would you mind just for a couple of minutes talking a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Dr. Humbert, do you want to take the lead?
No, I think you're so much better at this than I am.
Okay. Well, STEP, like you said, is one of the resources for online training and education, where the content is primarily created by Dr. Humbert and the medium that handles the logistics and the administrative stuff and gets everything out there. But it was our idea. We created this online platform together with the mission of making normal swallowing and dysphagia assessment and treatment resources affordable, most importantly, and accessible to everyone around the world. So everyone should have that same level playing ground that they're starting with, this basic training and education that we believe was missing at the graduate level, that empowers clinicians to have the knowledge they need to help patients with swallowing disorders. So we have very affordable membership plans with over 75 hours of content that covers everything you need to know about normal swallowing anatomy and physiology, assessment, treatment, and some professional issues in dysphagia management. And for those who are looking for more advanced training, Dr. Humbert has swallow physiology masterclass courses. We have a documentary, and we have some other resources that can really help you learn more about swallow timing measures and MBS interpretation, and kind of have that more advanced skill set to help patients. So in a nutshell, it's your all-in-one learning resource for dysphagia education.
Would you say how comprehensive it is what sets it apart? What do you think, as the creators of this, think really sets it apart from other things that are out there?
Well, I can answer that since I created almost all of the content.
Yeah.
What sets it apart is it's really almost our diverse way of seeing the world. I spent hours and hours and hours in meeting after meeting after meeting, course after course after course, and I realized everybody is presenting in exactly the same way. And what I would do for me to learn the literature at the NIH, I didn't know anything about swallowing when I got my master's. When I started my PhD, I still didn't know. And I was like, I have to learn this. So I plowed through the literature. And every time I read it, I realized the paper doesn't make it clear, but I have to translate that into something that makes sense to me. So I would always make an analogy in my head to make it make sense. I would draw it out. I'd graphically explain it to myself that way. So I took my self-learning tool and realized this can be helpful for other people. So it's really taking things out of that very dry, black and white line drawing with an annoying voice saying, and here now you have the, that kind of thing, to moving it forward to what if you paired it alongside something they already understand? Now they're just they're making that connection as opposed to take this dry material and make it make sense in a system that doesn't care if you ever know how a swallow works. You have to make people learn it despite themselves. And so I think that's what's really important. Then, and of course, it's comprehensive, but also the fact that anything can be comprehensive, like a textbook, but you don't remember much about it. So I think the punch is that we really get people to understand the literature through a little bit of, it's like edutainment a little bit more instead of just education.
Which is where the world is today, right? I'll just say, I think we've moved away from the generation that came before us and said, oh, what is this TikTok and what is this Facebook and online learning and education? Like, I think we just have to accept that it's here. We have AI now and we have virtual reality and we have augmented reality. And probably 10 years down the line, that's how everybody is going to be learning. There won't be textbooks. So online education is not this unconventional approach that we put out there. And this is how steps should help you learn and is different. It's just everywhere. That's how everybody learns now. Our phones are like an extension of our personality. And I think we just have to embrace those changes and realize that those of us who are willing to adapt to this change and leverage technology and integrate it into our training, our education, our clinical workflows are only going to be more successful and better clinicians and can then help patients have better outcomes. It's not something we have to be afraid of and try to stick to our traditional methods of training.
It's almost like you're willing to adapt and think outside of the box or something, right?
I'm just saying it's the box. That's the box now.
I mean,
I don't think it's even outside the box. I think we're so beyond that.
I mean, technology is only getting better. So it makes sense that it will help us to learn a little better too, versus just reading it all on paper. But I agree. I can't overstate how much I agree that I believe that one of the biggest strengths with it is how it distills complex information into a way that is memorable. It's not just data and statistics. It has that, but it's in a way that's very memorable. And so I appreciate that. Anything else before we wrap up?
Well, congratulations on a podcast that is hopefully filling an important gap. In order for your podcast to be named what it is, you have to admit that there's a gap. And so we have to get to a place where disagreement is not the end of the conversation. And in fact, pushing through that is what's really good for us. And so this is yet another forum where we can do that, where we can understand it's the friction that makes us better. The friction that is necessary if it's constructive and not destructive. And you are giving us a forum to have constructive friction so that we can get better the next time. So bravo.
Thank you. I don't feel like I deserve it. I feel like I've been very, very blessed by people who are willing to talk with me. And so if I can provide a platform for people who are smarter than me to go out there and tell what they're doing, there we go. That's it. I've done my part. So, I mean, not to limit it, but I want to keep going. But that, at least it makes me feel good that I can do that. So thank you both.
Well, it's definitely making a big difference. And I think, again, it just adds to the fact that we can learn through podcasts and Instagram and TikTok, and it doesn't have to be in the confines of a paid journal or a super expensive conference. I think there's just so many people who are willing to share their diverse perspectives and voices now. And I think we just have to be open to learning and having that growth mindset, and that's going to make all the difference.
Absolutely. And so a theme that is run throughout this is I'm not going to say this is the whole reason, but a big part of the reason why diversity matters is because you get different opinions, you get different life experiences, different perspectives, people who have been through adversity and can bring that to the table and are going to, the radiologist wants to leave, the patient aspirates, and no, you've had resilience. This isn't the first time you've had someone try to step away when it's not the right thing to do. Yeah. But also with podcasts and with things that anybody can access, and it's not just people who are of a certain mindset, you get differing opinions and you get conversations started. And so this allows people from everywhere, you don't have to pay to go online and listen to a podcast, to listen and get the conversation started wherever they are and bring their own unique strengths and experiences to it. And that's what I think is invaluable about this to me. So. Cool. Well, thank you so much. Really is a pleasure. Great to see you both. Have a great rest of your weekend. For everybody tuning in, please tell your friends, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Great. Thank you.
Both of our guests have such unique and rich backgrounds to consider. The contributions that Dr. Humbert and Rinki have made to medically focused speech pathology are quite remarkable. I love that their stories help me to see things from a new angle, from perspectives and experiences beyond my own. Don't miss out on Gap Education's first live webinar coming up with Dr. Martin Brodsky, Joe Puntillo, Dr. Kendrea Grand, and George Barnes on April 20th. Dysphagia management in patients with pulmonary compromise, ICU, and beyond. It's in collaboration with Tim's Medical for ASHA CEUs. For details about this and more, check out swallowthegap.com/live courses. That's swallowthegap.com or gapslp.com/live courses. Thanks again for being with us. Please tell a friend about the podcast or the webinar coming up, and we hope to see you there and see you next Tuesday for a new episode.